What did King Henry VIII think about the princes in the Tower? This is a question that has been on my mind for a while. This cannot be answered conclusively. According to today's knowledge, the Tudor monarch has not left us a direct testimony in which he takes a stand. However, there are some indications whose interpretation is promising. That Henry was interested in the fate of the princes in the Tower seems plausible for three reasons. 1. They were his blood relatives. Edward V and Richard of York were his maternal uncles. 2. If they survived, they would have threatened his rule. It hardly seems credible that a man as power-hungry as Henry did not want to have security in this regard. 3. Henry was almost 12 years old when his brother Arthur died, and he became heir to the throne. He thus moved between Edward and his younger brother Richard. At least this parallel should not have escaped his mother, who had been caring for him until then, but now had to hand him over to the care of her husband. Elizabeth of York was in church asylum with her mother when she handed over the younger of her sons into the care of the future Richard III. The situations were, of course, completely different, but they were mothers and their second-born sons. By remaining silent about the princes, Henry supported his father's narrative that Edward and his younger brother were murdered by their uncle Richard III in the Tower. Various indications suggest that he probably actually thought so. However, they can also be interpreted to the detriment of the Tudors. Henry originally wanted to give his own name to his firstborn son. The two boys he had with Catherine of Aragon he named Henry and gave them the title of Duke of Cornwall. However, the two children died in infancy. He then had an illegitimate son, Elizabeth Blount, who was named Henry. According to various rumors, Henry Carey could also be his son, as his mother Mary Boleyn was the king's mistress for some time. Subsequently, Henry VIII still did not give up his own name for a son. The first son Henry fathered, with Anne Boleyn, was also called Henry, or should be called Henry. To this day, it has not even been conclusively clarified that Anne really gave birth to a boy in 1534. 2 years later, this was certainly the case. Now, however, Henry changed his name. If he had been inconspicuous with his own name up to this point, as far as the princes in the Tower were concerned, it was now becoming explosive. The child was to be named Edward, named after Edward the Confessor and Henry's grandfather, Edward IV, who was a role model for the Tudor king. Henry, as is well known, stuck with this name. His son, from Jane Seymour, who survived, was also called Edward. He became Edward VI, although, as explained, it was not directly named after Edward V. Henry did put his uncle in the spotlight with this name. First, Henry expressed in this way that he recognized his uncle as the legitimate king of England. Secondly, he seems to have been sure that his uncle was no longer alive. Edward V would not step forward and claim his crown, as the reigning king had just recognized him again. The older of the princes in the Tower would have been 65 years old at the birth of Anne's son. This was very old for the time, but not too old that he had to be dead. Through Edward VI, Henry inevitably also remembered Edward V and the story of his disappearance, or rather, his assassination, as the narrative was at the time. A certain resemblance between his son and his uncle must not have escaped him. His son, like Edward V, had several older sisters. Edward VI was born late in Henry's reign. Edward V was born 10 years after his father was proclaimed king, who until then had no heir to the throne because he did not trust his daughters. This equation between Edward V and VI continued through the centuries. Most of the late paintings of Edward V are based on Edward VI. Henry VIII must not have missed the fact that he made a great allusion to Edward V by naming his son. Hardly any other king was as meticulous in succession planning as Henry VIII, and this too is likely to be a lesson he had gained from the fate of the princes in the Tower. Henry VIII had 3 laws on succession passed. This is unique in the history of England since 1066. Henry, driven by his unbridled control addiction, wanted to be prepared for all eventualities. Under no circumstances should there be a situation like 1483 in which the legitimate succession could be doubted. Edward V did not have a law of his own that made him king. His claim to the crown was based on the Act of Accord. Due to the accusation of illegitimacy, he could therefore be excluded from the succession to the throne without any problems. Edward VI had a law that expressly designated him as an heir. The text in the 3rd act of the succession is fascinating and leaves little doubt that Henry was thinking of the princes in the Tower. Thus, Edward VI is awarded as an heir as follows: to the first son of his body, between His Highness and his then lawful wife, Queen Jane. No claim to legitimacy is noted here. That Henry did not take this for granted is shown by the requirement he made of Edward's potential children in the law so that they could inherit the crown, and to the heirs of the body of the same first son lawfully begotten. This law thus made it impossible to deprive Edward VI of the crown on the accusation of illegitimacy. However, it had to be his heirs. At the same time, Henry opened the door for Edward to name daughters as heirs. I interpret this as an allusion to his own story. All in all, Henry effectively ruled out a repetition of what happened in 1483 and wanted to secure this permanently. Henry's will also reflects this. He named a privy council for Edward to rule for him. He expressly stipulated that there should be no protector. The fact that things turned out differently and that there was another parallel between Edward V and VI in Edward Seymour should be ignored. Henry didn't want it, probably thinking of Richard. 2 of the sources that are often cited when it comes to the princes in the Tower date back to the time of Henry VIII and were massively promoted by him. Thomas More's The Story of Richard III and Edward Hall's The Union of the 2 Noble and Illuster Families of Lancaster and York, better known as Hall's Chronicle. More deserves a special remark. He wrote his manuscript between 1513 and 1518. At that time, the king had already noticed him, and the 2 men felt a friendly bond. More has repeatedly provoked a lot of opposition because he reports on conversations in great detail, although decades later he took up the pen. I am fascinated by the theory, which is absolutely unprovable, that Henry himself provided information he received from his mother, Elizabeth of York. A falsified version of More's work was published during Henry's lifetime, in 1543. It was only under Mary that the original version found its way to the public. Tim Thornton was able to prove that More spoke to some children of those involved at the time. Why should Henry VIII, of all people, be an exception? As I said, it's just a theory that can't be proven. But the fact that Henry VIII used More to spread his perspective and possibly incorporate things he had learned from his mother is exciting. What is certain is that both More and Hall wrote the version of events that satisfied all Tudor kings. It is also certain that strong propagandistic colorations in both works cannot be denied. Hall's work is much worse than More's. What remains is the interpretation of the evidence of how Henry saw the princes in the Tower. I find the text of the law, Henry's will, and the naming of his son convincing that he was convinced that Richard III had the princes killed in the Tower. However, I am not blind to the fact that all the evidence and trials mentioned here can also be interpreted in such a way that the Tudors wanted to cleverly expand their propaganda, especially since Henry occupies a top position among the monarchs of the family in matters of propaganda. But your opinion is as good as mine. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Bye.